James, James Bond, 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 Bond, James Bond. Tell the truth, girls and guys. Even though I'm auditioning for this part in James Bond with future future agency, I'm getting a little bit fed up of doing it, of doing the actual audition, the same thing, repeating the same thing over and over again. But if this what it takes to get in the part, I'm willing to do the sacrifices. I'm willing to do the sacrifices anyway, regardless. So let me continue as I mean to go on. I've got 20 minutes recording left, or about 20 minutes. So James Bond, 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 trying to each as well. James Bond, falling asleep here as well, feeling tired. I am. James Bond, 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 Bond, James Bond. Oh, tired. Bond, James Bond. We can fall asleep when I'm bored. Bond, James Bond. Or I get tired when I'm bored. I get tired when I'm bored. Bond, James Bond. Sorry about the nails, I'll cut them soon, don't worry. Bond, James Bond. Bond, James Bond. Bond, James Bond. Not Jenny Bond. James Bond. Bond, James Bond. James Bond. My name is James Bond. The name is Bond. James Bond. The name is James Bond. The name is James Bond. The name is Bond. 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 James Bond. Bond. James Bond. The name is Bond. James Bond. The name is Bond. James Bond. At 8 minutes past 11 p.m. Friday the 15th of December 2023. The name is Bond. James Bond. 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 James Bond. future future agency. We all hear voices. You can agree on that, I presume. We all hear voices, even though if we don't, that means we're purposely cutting off and stopping to hear God's voices. Now, if you trust the voice you hear, surely you can trust me in delivering a good project in James Bond. Me playing the starring role of James Bond. I'm not trying to plead with you, but I think if you trust the voice that you hear, surely you can trust me in doing the role for life, forevermore, James Bond, 007. I've got acting experience. 4 years of study drama at college, and I was going professionally as well. Please consider me.